Good morning and welcome to Ask the Expert. I'm Joe Taylor. This morning, another in the ongoing series of programs presented by the Northwest Regional Key Program for Quality Early Learning. The program, through the Northwest Institute of Research, oversees a grant from the Office of Child Development and Early Learning at the Pennsylvania Department of Human Services and the Department of Education. The goal of the program is to improve the outcomes for young children as they prepare for school. John Poza from the Pennsylvania Key is the host of the program, and he's here with us throughout the series. Good morning, John, and who do we have this morning?
Good morning, Joe. This morning we have Samantha Gray from the Pennsylvania Office of Child Development and Early Learning. She is the manager for the Community Innovation Zone project. Sam will discuss this federally funded project under the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge and how grantees across the state, comprised of early learning centers, community agencies, and school districts, are working to improve the outcomes of children from preschool through grade 3. Prior to coming to OCDEL, Sam spent 10 years in early childhood education, including time as an early childhood center director and as a certified instructor, regularly delivering over 50 hours a year in instruction. Welcome to the program, Samantha.
Hi, John. Thank you.
Yes. First of all, we wanted to discuss the project itself, how it came about, and some details on, how exactly is the Community Innovation Zone project benefiting children?
Sure. So I guess I'll start with kind of how the program was conceived and its purpose. So when Pennsylvania received the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge grant, one of the things that we recognized was that there was a lot of really important work happening in communities that we potentially were not aware of. And that oftentimes, from a state perspective, we say, okay, these are the things we want you to do, and we kind of push down. But we recognize that there are things that folks know in their local communities because they know them better than we do. We certainly don't have our finger on the pulse of every single community across Pennsylvania, and that things that might work in a rural community would look very different in an urban community, et cetera. So the idea was to kind of look for those opportunities to support local initiatives, to give folks the opportunity to develop or trial some things that they thought, wow, if we could just do this in our community, it would have a huge impact. So that was the idea. And we wanted to make sure that it was specific to communities so that we wanted to have lots of small grantees. So if folks are familiar with the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge across the country, a lot of other states have things similar to community innovation zones. Some of them call them transformation zones, but they are much larger, almost like what our regional keys are. They might have, 5 or 6 transformation zones in a state. But we were kind of unique in having 50 zones because we really wanted to get down to that kind of very close circle, right, of the community. So that's why it is a partnering elementary school and a school district, an early learning program, and some community partners that kind of form the core of the grant.
Yes, and also in terms of that partnership with the early learning centers and the school districts and the community agencies that work with children, another major component of it is obviously involving families.
Yes.
And how are the families themselves to become engaged in the innovation?
Well, part of, there were certain grant requirements, and one of those was to have a focus on family engagement. So each zone had to specifically address how they were going to engage families in their work, and they're all doing it in very different ways. But we encourage folks to have families, and many of our grantees do, actually on and part of their kind of steering or collaborative groups, so that families are helping to inform decisions that are happening in their community, learn how to advocate, and partner. So that was a specific grant requirement that each grantee had to have some really specific strategies targeted to real family engagement around helping families become leaders in their communities, recognizing them as their child's first teacher, things of that nature. So that was a specific grant requirement for us.
You deal with two very different counties, different types of counties. Center, which of course is home to Penn State, and Clearfield County, which obviously is more rural. How does promoting early childhood learning differ between these two different type of counties?
Well, it's interesting because we actually made so the way that the grant process worked, I'm going to go back a little bit and then answer your question. We originally talked about, the grants were awarded in two phases. Phase 1 was last year. Phase 2 is happening currently in the awarding process. And in phase 1, we talked about neighborhoods, and we got a lot of feedback from our rural communities saying, the idea of a neighborhood isn't quite the same as it is in an urban area, right? Because we were thinking, like square blocks, in an urban area, that's your neighborhood, or a cul-de-sac, or, things like that. And in rural communities, some kiddos are traveling, an hour, 45 minutes, an hour one way just to get to school. So this idea of community and neighborhood was very different. So that was part of what we had to do, was kind of expand the way that we talked about it and thought about it, because we recognized that in an urban setting, you might be able to walk down the street to your collaboration, right, to the folks in your collaboration. You might be able to find them right next door, whereas in rural communities, it might be a little bit more travel involved and trying to figure out how to coordinate meeting spaces and things like that. And that also speaks to when John asked about, the family engagement piece. Family engagement looks very different in rural communities. Transportation is often a huge barrier because there's not as much public transportation. Again, folks can't necessarily carpool as easily or walk. So those are some of the very basic kind of barriers that need to be addressed in terms of helping families get engaged and doing some cross-sector, when we talk about cross-sector work, getting early childhood programs and elementary schools talking and things like that.
Now, I know in order to qualify for the grant, the applicant had to, in their community, show that they were basically going to address, working with an at-risk population. And that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people in terms of what at-risk would be. Can you kind of explain those communities that would basically had qualified for this grant and how they addressed at-risk?
Sure. So, again, lesson learned from year 1 to year 2. All of the grantees are assessed on economic risk factors that's outlined and defined within the school performance profile that the state puts out. So that was a baseline that every school has to report on. So that was one way we could very easily make an apples-to-apples comparison. And then also OCDEL does the reach and risk report, which assesses the level of accessibility of early learning programs, high-quality early learning programs in a community. So that was another across-the-board piece of data that we could look at to, again, compare and evaluate risk factors. So those were two pieces that every grantee had to respond to. In the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge grant federally, those are two risk factors, in addition to homelessness, migrant families, developmental delays, and English language learners. And the interesting thing is not every school has to report on those. So it was very difficult in year 1 to make a comparison because we didn't have data on every single grantee, because not every district is required to report on those things. So the way that we changed it was we asked, in the second phase of grants, asked folks to pool. They could choose any one of those risk factors or all of them, and then they could report and share data with us at their local level and how those potential risk factors were impacting student success and family success within their own communities. So those were the risk factors that we outlined. There's certainly plenty more that could be defined, right? As you had said, John, risk
right.
can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but those were the ones that we chose because they aligned with the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge federal risk factors.
Right, and one of the things I wanted to bring out, because in case the listeners are wondering, well, who are the grantees? Who got grants in my area? We are not at liberty to name who the grantees are. They have been selected in the second round, but because of the current state budget impasse, we won't disclose them. But I can tell you that 12 are in the northwestern part of the state, of which I have some responsibility for providing technical assistance to those folks. And so when the time comes, we will talk more about them. But one of the other things, Sam, that I wanted to bring up is that the grantees also had to incorporate some portion of what's called the P to 3, meaning preschool to grade 3 continuum. And that was a concept that it's basically being adopted by several states, including Pennsylvania. That was developed by a researcher, Christy Cowers from the University of Washington. Can you address that a little bit about what P through 3 continuum, that framework, is all about, and how it ultimately will lead to better child outcomes?
Sure. So you'll hear pre-K to third. You'll also hear P3, essentially, and even in Dr. Cowers, when she presents her work, even though it's titled pre-K, her intention around that is anything prior to kindergarten. So in Pennsylvania, we have a prenatal to third grade focus. So when you hear that, that's the kind of age span that we're talking about. And the reason that folks are focusing on this time frame is because thanks to brain research, there's lots of research that indicates that this time from prenatally, making sure that mothers get appropriate prenatal care, through age 8 is this kind of sweet spot for children, and we've seen that the brain development is the most rapid, the brain is most plastic, there's neural connections happening, so it's a really, really nice time, a ripe time, a perfect time to make sure that we're getting in there and making sure that we're helping to set a positive trajectory for children's learning. So again, within that time frame, P3, what we wanted folks to really start to think about, which is again part of the reason why we asked for those partners, is we oftentimes become siloed. We focus on, I only work with 0 to 5, or I only work through, kindergarten through 5th grade. And we wanted people to start to talk to each other and learn from each other and figure out what can we do to help produce better child outcomes, because the reality is, and the focus of Dr. Cowers' work, is that it's really about adult behavior change and systems change. So looking at things like making sure that we have effective teachers and administrators, that our learning environments and our instructional tools are of the highest quality possible, that we are engaging families in real and meaningful ways, that we're using data to make decisions and not just what we've always done or what we think feels good or looks good, but that we're using actual data. And then again, this idea that there is a consistent those factors are addressed consistently from birth to 3rd grade. So our grantees had to think about that in terms of their work. A lot of folks like to focus on transition to kindergarten, and it's a really important time, and that should be focused on, but what about before that, and what about after that? How do we make sure that we are kind of stretching our work to try and capture children? I mean, the research has shown us that you can see achievement gaps as soon as 9 months old, right? So we need to reach back as far as we possibly can to start to address some of those risk factors to ensure that students have the most success possible. So that was it's a really broad look at P3 and the reason for it, but that's what we're trying to do, is to produce better student outcomes, reduce the achievement gap by affecting adult behavior change and systems change instead of continually focusing on, addressing the child outcomes. Those will come naturally. Those will be born out of the systems change and the adult behavior change. It's not that they're not important and they should be held in the forefront, but we oftentimes, it's like putting a Band-Aid on it, right? It's more important to kind of look at those underlying factors and what we can do to create the type of change that we'd really like to see.
Samantha, John is obviously the expert My role on the program
Not
is to
by a long shot.
my role is to be kind of everyman and maybe back off a little bit and
Sure.
and look for some questions to broader answers. And I think the common national overview of programs like Race to the Top, Head Start, these types of programs, is that these programs are aimed primarily at urban children of poverty. How relevant is this situation where there is a deficiency going into kindergarten or even preschool here in our rural areas?
Really, it spans, right? It's not, I know we often tend to talk about urban settings, but we have actually, what's interesting is our grantees, the split between urban and rural is almost equal. So the number of grantees that we have that are in urban settings and the number that we have that are in rural settings is almost equal. So it's persistent in our rural communities as well for a lot of different reasons. But poverty is poverty, right? Just as a side note, it was very interesting to me because I travel around to see the grantees, and I was in an urban setting that was obviously impoverished, boarded up buildings, people on the streets just kind of wandering around because nobody has work. Very typical kind of, again, if you can imagine a streetscape in a city that's just boarded up and graffitied and all of that, and people with nothing to do. And the next week I went to visit one of our rural grantees, and it was exactly the same thing. It was boarded up buildings, shops closed, people pushing babies in carriages because there was no work, couldn't afford childcare, things like that. Just there were a lot more people on the street in the urban setting than there were in the rural setting. But the trials are the same. The effects of poverty, the effects of joblessness, those things are all still the same. We still have homelessness. We still have migrant families. We have a grantee that works in southern Lancaster County that has migrant families that are also English language learners, and the achievement gaps are persistent there as well. So I do, and I think it's important for us to keep, because Pennsylvania has what we call the rural T, right, up the middle and across the top. And we've been making a lot of efforts. We have, as part of the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge grant, a specific rural outreach component and trying to get rural early learning providers into our quality assurance systems to make sure that kiddos have equal access, regardless of where they live, whether it's urban or rural, to high-quality early learning programs. I just think it persists. It just looks a little different.
Right. And I think you addressed one of the key differences between the rural populations in terms of comparing to the urban sites is that is an access issue as well, because obviously the more rural, chances are in some pockets of our state, there's difficulty in their accessibility, families' accessibility to quality early childhood. And then with that comes transportation issues as well, and how to get to transport your child, or if there is even transportation that's available. But that's an ongoing issue. And even with such programs as Head Start, because of the nature of the transportation, how far the families are to the center, sometimes even Head Start cannot provide, depending upon their particular location, does not have the funding to provide transportation, which is difficult.
Right, absolutely. Or, there a lot of our rural communities rely on, family and family care and group care because a center can't sustain, right? You can't have an early learning center because they just can't function economically because of, again, like you said, distance and transportation issues and such. So, making sure that we're reaching our family and group home providers, because that's where a lot of our kiddos are,
right. And the thing that, if I can kind of put my own personal look at the Community Innovation Zone grantees, is I just think, and you don't find these things coming along very often, and this is what the beauty of the program coming from Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge, is that we are actually giving communities the opportunity to show what are they doing innovatively. In terms of their cooperative working relationship with their school districts, with families and so forth, that maybe others can learn from. So they've been given a lot of flexibility in their programs. And so hopefully not only in Pennsylvania can we all learn from the progress that they're making, but we're hoping that in many ways they can become like pilot programs that maybe can be replicated even beyond just Pennsylvania.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, working with our first round of grantees. And if folks are interested, they can go onto the PQAS website or Pennsylvania Department of Education's website to get the list of the first 12 grantees that have been operating for a year now. They kept saying to us, just tell us what you want us to do, just tell us what you want us to do, because that's typically what happens with a grant, right? It's we set forth these things and you say how you're going to meet them, and then they go out and do. It's not like that with this grant opportunity. There are a few grant requirements, but the rest is you tell us what you want to do and we will help you do it. We're going to fund you. We're going to give you technical assistance, support, so that whatever works in your community, we want to know what happens in your community, what works. And then, like you said, John, what can be shared and pushed up? So I talked earlier about the push down, right? We're so used to the state saying this is what you need to do, and that gets pushed down. This is the opposite. We're asking what's happening in the local community and share that, push that up so that maybe we can figure out how what works over in Venango County, might work in Luzerne, in another rural community. So things like that. It's part of what is very exciting for me as the grant manager to see all of the different initiatives and the ways that folks are really making some serious efforts and making some headway and trying to improve outcomes for children and for families across the state.
Sam, you brought up Venango County, which happens to be my home county where I grew up in. And in the first round, they received the Community Innovation Zone grant. And sometimes with a grantee, even though their project is to do X, they find out through doing that project that there are other opportunities or things that develop between their partnerships that they actually also got involved in. So in that county, they had, it was child development centers, and they're doing a program working with their particular local elementary school where they were having issues with behavioral issues with children and they're being prepared to enter kindergarten from preschool. And they do a research-based program with these children that has really had a tremendous impact, where they've been able to actually use the grant to hire another part-time school psychologist to actually see more kiddos. But at the same time, while doing the project, they worked in a collaborative relationship with their court system, where there's a lot of children that have parents that are incarcerated. And it turned out that in cooperation with the county and other agencies, the court actually built a separate meeting room so that when when the kiddos visit their parents, they're in a closed, private area where they're allowed human contact with their own parent. And that really, especially with a young child, works wonders. Yeah,
that's one of the more beautiful stories that has come out of these kind of unintentional things, through the work, right? So they were able to use the Race to the Top funds to leverage this work that they've done with incarcerated families. I mean, they have a staff member that goes to court dates with these families, with these parents, that help support the folks that are supporting the children while parents are incarcerated. And I think what's nice is it's this combination of we still, right, families or the parent that's committed the crime and is incarcerated, has to be held accountable, but the children didn't do that, right? The children are now being supported more fully in that community because of the leveraging of these resources. So it's just one of those kind of beautiful outcomes that no one expected. It was not what they set out to do at all. Right. Sam, they didn't write for that in the grant. No, but it absolutely just happened, and it's a very beautiful thing. Sam, that is a perfect wrap for the program, and unfortunately we're out of time, but we're going to have you on again when we're able to talk a little bit more about the grantees and the progress they're doing. But I thank you so much for being on the program today. Yeah. Thank you for having me. It was wonderful. Thank you both. And that's our program for today. We'll be back in 2 weeks at this same time. In the meantime, you can go online to learn more at papromiseforchildren.com. For John Posa and the Northwest Regional Key Program for Quality Early Learning, I'm Joe Taylor. Thank you for listening,
and have a great day.